Yes, good evening, good evening, good evening. My name is Adesoji Iginla, and welcome again to Adesoji Speaks and this edition of African News Review, episode 1. And I'm joined with a very special guest, a man who I respect his work. He is not just a journalist, a columnist, a social commentator, an author, and one on which I would say his work, one of his most pivotal works, is what this program is based on, which is a book. And I would share his book titled How Manufacturing Hate, How Africa Was Demonized in the Western Media. This is my copy here. I would ask you to try to get your copy. You can hear him laugh, which means good luck with that. But as I understand, you might be lucky enough to get one on Amazon if the ancestors are indeed with you. Yes, without further ado, I would let the man even add a bit of words. But prior to him doing so, I should also add that he also has a knack for going around and naming things. And I wonder where he got that idea from. But welcome, Brother Milton.
Okay, asante sana. Thank you. Thank you, comrade, for the good work you do in enlightening our people, in making the connections, linking all the dots in our history. As the late Abdurrahman Mohammed Babu, to also run this book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. In order to understand where we are today, we have to know our past. In order to understand where we might be heading, we have to know our present. And you can't know the present without the past. So I'm paraphrasing what you said. So it's very important that we discuss how our history has shaped where we are today in contemporary society. Without any connection to the history, we're just groping around in the dark, looking for solutions in the dark. And that is why we've really been wandering in the forest for the last 60 years, since most African countries won independence. That's why independence has remained independence on paper alone. So sometimes you have to operate outside the box. For example, you mentioned my discovery. I believe this would be actually the 4th year anniversary now.
Yeah.
On this coming next week, on April the 23rd, when I was just wandering around in the jungles of Europe, and I came upon this long river, and I asked the European natives, I said, what's going on here? And they claimed it was called the Thames. I have no understanding of what that meant. So I asked one of those European natives to take my photograph posing in front of this river, which then I renamed, of course, River Gulu. And for some reason, it connected very well with many Africans who now started to make that connection. What right did Europeans have to rename our countries, to rename our lakes, our rivers, our mountains, and impose their cultural, intellectual hegemony? Even the Europeans understood, because the BBC did a short item about it, a short story, and other media outlets also wrote about it. So it's important that we reclaim our past, our history, our culture, tradition, by any creative means necessary. And now with the new media that we have, we can make those connections. I invite sisters and brothers to go out there and make their own explorations of darkest Europe, or even darkest North America, and rename these mountains and rivers and lakes. Why not? And let them think about it. It lets them think. In fact, the point was made in the same BBC article about it, They touch upon how Europeans had gone to Africa and done that. And also, thank you for mentioning my book. My book, of course, in similar vein, I went back and I read the European literature. And when I say European, that includes North America as well. How Africa was dehumanized and demonized in the newspapers, in books by the so-called explorers who renamed these monuments, as I just mentioned earlier, from the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Of course, those were scouts. They were sent there to gather intelligence, which then benefited formal colonization of Africa in the last 2 decades of the 19th century. So the book, when it was first published in 2020, the book was selling very well. And I know that because I was getting a hefty royalty check on a regular basis. But then I think maybe the publisher was not familiar with the impact that the book might have. Now it seems to me that the publisher is afraid to push and sell my book, which the publisher owns the copyrights to. So it's been very difficult for people to get copies of it. In fact, last year, I was surprised. I was in class and I asked my students whether they'd read the chapter so we can discuss a couple of the chapters. And one of my students said, "Oh, Professor, I could not get a physical copy. That's what I wanted. They only have the digital copy." I said, "Oh, no. When you go to the publisher's website, there are 2 options. One is for digital, one is for hard copy. You should click on the hard copy." "Professor, I really tried." I said, "Oh, no, I'll show you. Bring your computer over to my desk in front of the class." That was when I discovered for the first time that my own publisher had stopped producing the hard copy, even though the contract says both hard copy and digital. So that's why it may be difficult to get a copy of the book, but I'm working with some other publishers. And if I get a deal finalized with another publisher, I will make sure I get the copyright back so that I can get a new publisher. Of course, they want me to pay money to regain my copyright back, but it's something worth doing since they seem to be afraid of the book.
I know it's a work that has to be celebrated in the sense that it goes to the heart of what, again, like I said, what the essence of this African News Review is about. Looking at the media, the story that they've written about us, our stories, how are they told, by whom, for whom, and devoid of their biases and prejudices. Because if you take a body of people and you already have a preconceived notion of who they are and what their narrative is, then you're doing both the person you're supposed to be giving said information to a disservice and undermining the humanity of the person you're reporting on. So one of your stories in there was of the gentleman who went to Nigeria who was reporting on the Biafra War.
Correct.
And coming back with the grass skirt stories. If you could just give an synopsis of that.
In fact, his name was Lloyd Garrison, and he was the descendant of the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. So his politics and inclinations were much more progressive compared to his peers and contemporaries as a European American. So he was reporting, it was posting from the East, actually, his articles. In fact, another very interesting thing that I didn't mention in the book, when I was going through the archives, I found a letter from his editors in New York saying they would get him out of the country as soon as possible because a Nigerian general had contacted the New York Times and said, "We cannot guarantee his safety if we were to catch you in eastern Nigeria." So reluctantly, for him, he was reluctant, but they got him out of the country. But to go to your question, when he was still there, And he read one of the articles under his byline published in the New York Times. He was shocked that between him writing it and sending it to New York by cable, in those days that was the use, the story had changed. Somehow, the editor sitting in New York inserted a reference to Nigerian tribesmen dressed in skirts made of grass leaf skirts. Nowadays, they call this what? Fake news, right?
Fake news, yeah.
Absolutely fake, manufactured out of cold, thin air by editors sitting in New York. And in their mind, a story file from Africa had to be represented in such a way. Obviously, they were not satisfied with what Adesoji had written.
Yep.
On the one hand, they preach objective journalism. On the other hand, they undermine an article written by their own correspondent. Think about that. The audacity. This is their own reporter having to now write to his editors and say, wait a minute, how did that end up in my story? I never saw anything like that. It's amazing. And now that's one of many examples. And now obviously people can understand why my own publisher is now afraid to sell my books widely, because the New York Times remains one of the most powerful media companies in the world today in the 21st century.
And yes, okay, so in light of that, you've taken us back memory lane, and we begin today's episode with the 30-year anniversary of the Rwandan Genocide. And
Yes.
why is it necessary to begin from there? Again, this last week, France decided it was time to say, what's the word they use? Let me share my screen. France decided it is time the Allies could have stopped the Rwandan genocide in 1994. Now, people will probably be wondering, why is this issue now coming to light? Unfortunately, there was a book written in the aftermath of the 1994 Rwandan genocide, 2004, the book came out. And it was written by the Canadian general who led the United Nations mission in Rwanda, Romeo Dallaire. And so Romeo Dallaire was of the opinion that the French could have done lots more, not least because they impounded machetes that was used in majority of the killings. But somehow those machetes found their way back into where it was supposed not to have gone. And so with France now coming out of a sudden to say, oh, yet we ought to have stopped this, what would you say is their motivation?
Okay, so I have a rather different take on the whole Rwanda tragedy, calamity of 1994.
Okay.
But I will first address the motives behind what France and Macron are saying, which is cynical on many levels. Part of what is not being widely covered right now is the tragedy in Eastern Congo.
Okay.
Which is, of course, the victim of an invasion by Rwanda. Chaos in Eastern Congo benefits Rwanda tremendously.
Okay.
In terms of the resources. But there was an estimate by Rwanda's Minister of Finance. It came out in the Financial Times maybe 2 years ago. In terms of resources that are extracted from Eastern Congo and exported by Rwanda. And the value was more than $1 billion. And that's a significant amount.
Wow.
Absolutely. So, obviously, Rwanda does not have the factories to utilize these resources. These resources end up being shipped to Europe, to North America, and to Asia as well. So by coming up with that statement, it seems to me that France has decided to be partner with Rwanda in this theft of Congo's resources. Which suggests that Congo is going to have difficulty in really exercising sovereignty over Eastern Congo, which of course is just laden with mineral resources.
Yeah.
So that's my reading of it. And then in terms of stopping the genocide of 1994, I think it would have been very difficult. In fact, France actually tried to get the United Nations Security Council to declare that at that time, before the planes were even shot down, before the genocide occurred, before the presidential plane carrying the late Governor Habyarimana, and as well as the president, of course, of Burundi.
Yes, the president.
And Tayemire and Cyprian was shot down. France had tried to get the Security Council to intervene and say that Rwanda had been invaded by Uganda, which of course it had been.
Yeah, had been.
In 1990, or in October 1. And what is not written about sufficiently was that, in fact, massacres had been occurring from 1990 all the way up to 1994 when the plane was shot down. So had the Security Council actually taken an interest and taken that position, Uganda might have been forced to actually withdraw. And that's not to say that Rwanda would not have remained a tinderbox with many problems. But of course, the problem is the land issue, one of the most densely populated countries in the world. Of course, that's number one. Number two, the issue of the descendants of Tutsi who had fled massacre when Rwanda became independent, and they had the initial revolution which got rid of the monarchy. And many Tutsi were killed at that time. Many fled to Kenya, Uganda, as well as to Tanzania. And they had remained in perpetual exile those many decades, and had always agitated to come back to Rwanda. And then, of course, many of them in Uganda, the young ones, had helped General Museveni
come to power.
Absolutely, to seize power in 1986. Part of what he had promised to them was that eventually, down the line, he would also help them
return the favor.
Absolutely, to invade and return to Rwanda. So those elements are always left out in the discussion. In fact, the country that owes major poverty to Rwanda and even reparations, the United States blocked the attempt to get this matter before the Security Council. Number one, it is the United States that provided weapons to Uganda. And later on, some units of the Ugandan armed force turned itself into the Rwanda Patriotic Front. Many people are not aware that Paul Kagame was actually an officer in the Ugandan army. He was a senior intelligence officer. He was sent because he was a Ugandan citizen at that time. He was sent by Uganda to train at Fort Leavenworth in the United States. It was after the invasion occurred, the first commander, I think his name was Fred Rugema, was killed. Under very mysterious circumstances, by the way, within the first 2 days of the invasion.
2 days of the first fight.
And then Kagame left his training at Fort Leavenworth, United States, went straight back to Uganda, and went to take command of the Rwanda Patriotic Front. So United States' role has not been effectively dealt with. It's much more destructive than the role of France, Belgium, or any other party. And that's the role that still needs to be fully explored, and its liability. In fact, one other point I would like to add, it is the United States that blocked a thorough investigation of the shooting down of the presidential plane.
The planes, yeah.
Which is discussed in a very interesting BBC documentary called Rwanda's Untold Stories. So if anybody wants to watch it, go on Google, put Rwanda's Untold Story, and it will take you to a link to Venmo, where you can watch the documentary, which of course the BBC is not promoting that documentary widely anymore because Rwanda declared the BBC a genocide denier after that documentary came out. But the documentary includes statements by who became Rwanda's ambassador to the United States, Rudasinghe, and it includes statements by General Nyamwasa, Kayumba Nyamwasa, who was Rwanda's chief of military staff. And both of them say, in fact, it was Kagame who ordered the plane to be shot down. Now, what would be the motive? The motive was that the peace treaty signed in Tanzania would have led to one man, one vote. And obviously, given the composition of the population, with Hutu being overall the majority, it would have been as if the rebellion had never happened, the invasion, because it would end up having a Hutu-dominated government. So the only way it could really come to power was by military means, and of course, by creating that conflagration, that tragedy, then it could then come and say, I'm the one who rescued the country. And that is actually what unfolded.
Wow, interesting. And to think we had a report that had less than 1,000 words, and you've just given us a walk down the history lane as to you won't get this in Western media anyway.
No, you won't. And that's part of the tragedy of Western media. They are weapons of mass distraction, weapons of mass disinformation. And part of it, of course, is to maintain this global narrative that, of course, allows the contradiction that the most wealthy continent in the world can at the same time have the most impoverished people in the world, by constantly referring to poor African countries, there's not a single poor African country. They are impoverished African countries. Impoverished comes by action that is being taken detrimental to Africa's development and growth. And that is why they remain impoverished, but they're not poor. In fact, Nkrumah used the best description in his book, which is always nearby because it's one of my favorite books.
Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism. Yes,
absolutely. In the introduction, what does Nkrumah say? Nkrumah calls it, you find this term very quickly right here. It's the best description. I propose to analyze neocolonialism first by examining the state of the African continent and showing how neocolonialism at the moment keeps it artificially poor. Artificially poor. That's what Nkrumah said. And it's not 100% correct. It is artificially poor. It is not poor in reality. How can a country like Congo, with all those resources that the developed industrialized world needs, how can Congo at the same time be one of the most impoverished countries? Doesn't make sense. It is because Congo's resources are exploited, the labor of Congolese are exploited, and you can duplicate that across every African country. And that explains our current situation.
Thank you very much. And yes, and which gives us a very important segue since we're still marking anniversary. Another anniversary would be the Chibok girls, who again 10-year anniversary of the Chibok girls being kidnapped from their school. 276 Nigerian girls snatched from their school. Some would escape, but from school in Chibok in northeast Nigeria, Borno State. And for years, they've been looked for, sought after, and the understanding is they were being held in Sambisa Forest. Now, Sambisa Forest is in a place bordering Nigeria and Chad. again, one cannot help but imagine what the possible motivation can be for their kidnap. Because when it happened in 2014, people were of the opinion that why kidnap girls and then devoid their families of contact and what have you. And the state has, to an extent, would say it has done what it can. Here's the thing. If you cannot protect your citizens, how is it you can call yourself a sovereign state?
Absolutely.
So my initial take was, when it happened, was, okay, we're looking at a country bordered in the northeast by Cameroon, Lake Chad, Republic of Chad, and Niger Republic. Now, what do all of them have in common? They all speak French. Now, why is that a key thing? Because initially it was like, this story does not add up. When you say you're Boko Haram, you're an Islamic insurgency, but you're attacking people who do the same thing as you, it just doesn't make sense. Now, some will say, but they're doing it to each other. The first major Islamic group that really took hold in Nigeria then was in the 1980s, and it was called the Matisine sect. The government crushed it, but then most of the people were not in favor of whatever it is they prefer as their dictum. But this one has taken on a turn which is hard to comprehend. And so, again, if you look through the news reports, you can't really piece anything together until you lay a series of events that have happened in around 2014. One was the fact that for the first time, power went from the north to the south in Nigeria. And some people saw it as a way of undermining the government. But even though that government has been out of power for now more than 12 years, the problem still persists. And now the kidnapping is not so much as ideological, it's financial. So you begin to see loads and loads of threads of economic issues, political issues, and obviously it takes a religious connotation because of who is seizing said girls.
Correct.
So what do you think?
You've touched on many of the possible motives and reasons behind it. And of course, a key amongst those is the weakness of the state itself. The Nigerian federal state, the nation itself, which of course is something that has been consistent pretty much since the country won its independence. Mm-hmm. The elite political class has really failed Nigeria tremendously. And of course, the failure continues. And it's not unique to Nigeria, so it's not like I'm laying any particular criticism or critique of Nigeria. I'm critiquing the African state, actually.
It's a legacy of colonialism.
The African state remains mostly a fictitious state, right? Where you have a power really centralized amongst the elite with no concrete connection to the grassroots, right?
Yes, sir.
So in a situation like that, it's not surprising that now you find when you need the National Army to intervene, National Army actually has no capacity to be effective in really dealing with this phenomenon. And that's now bedeviled Nigeria for decades. Just imagine a major nation like Nigeria with all its resources. If this had been made a national priority, who really believes that this issue would not have been resolved a long time ago? If Nigeria had said this is our number one priority, we will deploy the necessary military resources, the diplomatic resources, and the financial resources, of course, because it has to be a multi-pronged approach. You cannot say we're just going to have a military approach. We have firepower, and we will deal with that and crush the situation. Because, quite frankly, as you actually also alluded to, a lot of this also has issues connected with the marginalization of that part of the country in terms of education, in terms of economic development, in terms of deprivation. So young people have incentive to be recruited into the kind of activities that now would engage in. If they were really involved in alternative activities, I imagine the young people don't like to go out there and be hiding in the forest or in the jungles also, putting their lives at jeopardy if they had other activities that could allow them to flourish, actually. So these are all tied in together. And obviously, we've read many accounts of how even elements of the army sometimes collaborate with them in terms of selling them weapons. So that goes back to the elements that would want to undermine whoever is the president at that particular time. So it has to be a multi-pronged issue. It has to be sold to the nation as something that, if we resolve this collectively as Nigeria, it would benefit everybody in the country. But I don't think that approach has been taken. And I don't think the crisis is seen that way, personally.
True. And also, aside from that, it's also the fact that there's a lack of morale in the armed forces. Years and years of underfunding, lack of training, lack of materials. Again, yes, you want to do so much, but then if you don't have the capacity to approach the task at hand, you're defeated even before you've started. And so
I agree.
The loss in the course of executing the challenge itself, most of it had come from lack of equipment. There was a time when deserting became the only way they can register their dissent. But eventually, it died down now. At the moment, it's much more internal displacement. So the kidnapping is internal. So again, going back to what you were saying, it's the society lashing out at the lack of resources to carry out normal economic activities, and left to their own devices, if it's easy money, even at the cost of rupturing society.
Absolutely.
They're carrying out kidnappings.
And it's really tragic. It's sad, but it speaks to many of the underlying currents that are evolving in many African countries with a tremendously burgeoning youth population, right? When we're dealing with separate crisis points, but we're not making the connection that what connects all of them is that Africa has the world's youngest population. The employment opportunities are not expanding. So a lot of the disruptions that we see are actually very predictable. And the population, of course, continues to increase. The youth population continues to increase. The economic retraction is occurring in many African countries. So if we think that we are in a crisis position today, as we speak in 2024, where will the continent be in the next 5 to 10 years? It's actually quite frightening.
With the projections.
And in my own estimation, if we don't take radical transformative measures that are quite different from what we're engaged in right now, that the continent could become overwhelmed. And I'm not trying to create like a doomsday scenario, but if you look at the objective facts, the youth population continues to increase rapidly. Population in general on the African continent, fastest growing in the world. while employment opportunities diminish, and there's no industrialization, right? Just producing so-called raw materials, minerals, and agricultural products.
Industries, yes.
And we have to depend on the well wishes of the outside world. If they don't have demand for the products at one particular time, then it means income collapses. If there's a surge because they're producing more and they need raw materials, then income goes up. We cannot develop nations based on that type of erratic economic activity. So that's what I really mean, that we're in a position where we have to become much more insistent, much more demanding of the leadership.
Intentional.
And if the leadership are not presenting ideas how to address these issues, we must not tolerate their existence, because it means we as Africans subsidizing our own suicide. That's unacceptable.
So speaking of insisting things had to change, which brings us to the election of Bassirou Faye.
Yes.
The new president of Senegal. Right. And let's just say things have been very interesting right from his oath of office on Tuesday. And he immediately announced the appointment of Ousmane Sonko as his prime minister, which goes to show that it's no longer business as usual.
Right.
At 44, he is Africa's youngest elected president. He took his office promising systemic change and paying homage to many people killed. Again, like you said, people are not going to stand for the normal business as usual, but in fact will demand that because you have the power, or the power to do certain things have been resided in you, it's time for you to pick up the baton and run with it. And the question would be,
yes,
what do you think in terms of that election within Senegal, outside of Senegal, and for the greater Africa? What would be your take, or what do you think the media is not exactly telling us?
Okay, the media actually in this case have had no choice but to see things run ahead of the media, and which is you have no choice. You cannot no longer control the narrative, right? The narrative could have been controlled when Macky Sall, the president whose term just ended, was creating alternative narratives. First, he had postponed the elections. Now, the year before that, he had been thinking whether he would run again or not, finding loopholes, political loopholes to justify the possibility of running again. Of course, that led to protests in which security forces killed several Senegalese. So that narrative, of course, was dispelled instantly by the election, when people showed that even given only 3 weeks, they were prepared because they knew whom they wanted to vote for. They wanted to vote for Ousmane Sonko. But of course, he was barred by what he said was politically motivated criminal charges. Barred from running. And he had been incarcerated. And people were concerned at some point, should election proceed without him being allowed to be a candidate, what might it do in terms of stability of the Senegalese state? There was a genuine concern about that it could lead to the kind of street disruptions that could not be stopped by the military. And I think at some point, that also became clear to Macky Sall. And of course, he retracted his position and he allowed the elections to be held. And as they say, the rest is history. Since Ousmane Sonko had endorsed Faye, it was inevitable that he would win overwhelmingly, which he did. And then he appointed, of course, Songo to be the prime minister. One hopes that they continue to work in Congress, meaning in unison in terms of the political agenda and economic agenda that they share for the nation. So it's a very good sign for me, because obviously people who are familiar with Ousmane Sonko knew that he had been denouncing French political and economic imperialism, not only in Senegal in particular, but generally throughout West Africa. And in fact, my reading of what has happened in Senegal is that it's the same thing that's been unfolding in other West African countries, in Niger, in Burkina Faso, and in Mali. The only difference is that in those countries, the military was at the forefront of those changes. But those are a different type of military coup d'etat compared to the ones in the past, where you would see the general populace, in some instances, would come out to cheer the new leadership, because things are so frustrating that there's always a wish that something new in and of itself,
regardless of what.
Exactly, which of course has not been the case in many instances. Of course, it was the case when Thomas Sankara came to power in Burkina Faso, in what was then Volta, changed it to Burkina Faso, and implemented his socio-economic and political agenda, which was very beneficial for the country and set a very positive example for other African countries, which of course imperialism did not like. When you advocate independence and self-reliance, imperialism does not like that. But now Sankara's name is being echoed by the youth in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and it's the same thing that was also being echoed in Senegal. Only in Senegal, it did not get to a situation where the military had to become involved. But to be quite frank, it was not impossible that the military might have become involved had the elections been permanently postponed, had both Faye and Songo been denied the opportunity to run, and had either Macky Sall himself or his handpicked successor been rigged into the presidency. Then in that particular case, I would not have ruled the possibility that the military in Senegal might have done the same thing that has happened in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. So I see it as similar to what's evolving in West African countries. I think West Africa has been notoriously accused of being too passive and accommodationist to imperialism by France. But now, West Africa, led by the youth, is actually ahead of the game. And what the example they're setting might actually be transmitted to other parts of the continent. Central Africa, East Africa, going further. Of course, in South Africa, you have the economic freedom fighters, which is definitely a party of the young people. In South Africa, the constitution and the traditional relative democracy is gaining momentum at a better pace than in other African countries. So in South Africa, I don't see the risk or the need for the armed forces to be involved in the transition. The economic freedom fighters are not being harassed, unlike what we see in Uganda, for example, where you also have the youth movement led by Robert Kyagulanyi, A.K.A. Bobby Wine, who actually outright won the election in 2021, but the military dictator, Museveni, has refused to step down. In Uganda, I think that's an evolving story, and the military playing a role cannot be taken off the table in a place in Uganda. But in South Africa, where you have the youth are not being harassed, not being arrested, not being tortured, not being killed, but the party is functioning and the party is actually growing in each election cycle. So in South Africa, you can see that the youth empowerment coming to place through largely peaceful means, the way it happened in Senegal. Of course, there was
Senegal.
bloodshed during the uprising, but relatively, it was largely peaceful in terms of how the election itself was finally conducted.
For me, the standout thing was the fact that the election was called at a weekend. People turned out, and in 2 days, you knew who were because the result itself was clear. The people didn't mince their words. They were adamant that this is who we wanted. No matter any kind of trickery that the government had in store, everything just faltered because the people would just say, listen, this is who we're voting for. And that's it. Anything else we're not even interested. We're not even looking at. And
right.
so
We have to congratulate them, actually. Senegal has had a vibrant civil society for a long time in terms of protest, in terms of the security forces honoring the rights of the people to protest. Macky Sall almost changed that and was about to get security forces involved in partisan politics. And had he not been checked, had he not retracted, I was very fearful for where Senegal might have ended. So Senegal continues to set an example for other African countries. But I want to say there's not much of a difference between what is going on in Senegal than what is going on in Mali or Burkina Faso or Niger, which is to end exploitation of Africa by imperialism, in this case, French imperialism.
Okay, and speaking of imperialism, but this time internal imperialism, there's news making the rounds that your favorite president has chosen General Muhoozi Kainerugaba,
his son,
as army chief, with the possibility of him becoming possibly head of state.
Correct.
I'm sure he's done his internship.
Correct.
What would you read into that, really? Why now, though? Why now?
Why now? Because the country will hold elections.
He just had an election with,
And of course, in political timeline, 2 years is a very short time. So this is part of the dictator's campaign strategy, to have his son in control of those security forces, because there's actually a fear that the military might intervene and prevent him from continuing his dictatorship. He has been in power for 38 years now. I met with a retired Ugandan military officer last year here in New York, and he told me the level of dissent and division within the military in terms of the officers. And oh yeah, absolutely. And the thing that they detest the most is that the dictator would dare install his incompetent alcoholic son. And I have nothing against alcoholics in particular, but most alcoholics that are seniors, they seek help to improve their condition. But in this case, he actually is seeking power. He's proud of his condition, you know. But the officers are quite serious. People that have dedicated their years of service, and then see somebody who is promoted over them just because he just is the progeny, is the seeds of dictator Museveni. That to them is very galling, and it's actually reaching their limit. And this is an officer who speaks with these officers on a regular basis. And the word is that the military would not tolerate this. And now that it's installed him as the army commander,
the army chief,
it means that the tension within the officer corps, within the armed forces, is much more intensifying. I think this is an act of desperation, of course, by the dictator to find ways to prolong his regime. But there are a number of things. Number one, he does not have the kind of relationship that he had in the past with his number one sponsor, which is the United States.
Okay.
The United States, of course, was able to block the World Bank from providing any new credit, any new loans to Uganda, which is significant, beginning last year in August. So the budget is under tremendous pressure right now So what he's doing is increasing taxes on almost a monthly basis. So in fact, what is occurring right now in Kampala, many of the merchants are on strike. So many of the stores are shut down with many
So
streets.
there's no taxes.
Exactly. And these are the kind of issues that ultimately at some point can lead people to come out to the streets in mass numbers. And the word is that the military don't want to be ahead of the change. The military want the people on the streets to be at the forefront of any change.
To lead, yeah. Okay.
And then the military would not stop this change from occurring. So that's what we might see between now, 2026, before the elections, or we might see it after the elections. In other words, if you don't have the cohesiveness in the military establishment, it will be very difficult for you to rig elections once again, as they've done on several occasions in the past, just perpetuating its role. So that's my reading of what is going on. He thinks that by installing his son, he has a better chance to control the military. So his son will be gathering intelligence for him. People will be feeding intelligence to his son because obviously he's the commander now. But that intelligence alone, if the will is not to support you anymore, you may know as much as you know, but it won't stop things.
They can even feed you dot information.
Absolutely.
And so what you're now saying is he has no capital in terms of his geopolitical importance. You know, he did send some troops to Somalia.
Yes.
And his forays into Congo.
Correct.
And he's leaning on Kagame. So that is in jeopardy. That's what we can read into the situation.
Right. Because in Somalia, Kenya has also deployed, and the U.S. will probably deal with Kenya, actually. Seeing the Secretary of Defense, when he visited East Africa, he went to Kenya, not to Uganda. The Secretary of State has met with Kenyan President Ruto. Yeah. Ruto was in the White House. Museveni, yes, he was there when they had the U.S. African Business Summit. It was not the Ugandan leader being saying, come to the White House. It was just there when all the other African leaders happened to be there, but Ruto was invited to come. So they're working now closely with Kenya. So Kenya is now seen as the country that the U.S. would work with that would play the role that Museveni played in the past.
Okay, thank you for this inaugural premiere, which is hopefully people take a lot, and we hope to see you all next week, but this time at an earlier time between 6 and 7. And until next week, any famous words, comrade?
I always love Samara Michelle. I look to continue, the story continues. Although I have a very funny story. I forget who the author of the book was. It was about Fela.
Oh.
And Fela shared a plane with some of the fighters of Frelimo. I don't know where the plane was flying from where to where. So Fela went and got into conversation with them. And one of them said, "I'll do that continue." And Fela said, "What is that?" He said, "The struggle continues." Fela said, "Oh no, the struggle must end." That would be the solution. The struggle must end is better than the struggle continues. Only Fela can come up with something like that, right? He said, "Why we want the struggle to just keep continuing? It must end with victory."
Victory accepted. Victory accepted. Yeah,
thank you, comrade, everyone, for having me.
No, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming. Yeah, thank you for coming. Thank you.